Thanks, Kelly.
Perfect. All right, here we go. All right, so like last time, just going to take you through a quick status of where we're at in the project. This picture that is our background is from the previous workshop on the 7th, which we had some great turnout from and great engagement from the community. All right, so a lot of information on one page. Wanted to take you through where we are with every piece of the initiative. So my camera page has seen quite a good uptick in people viewing the website, as well as getting responses to the few questions that we've asked as well. So that's been great. And that uptick has really started to show through July. So hopefully we get a bit more of an uptake from that throughout the rest of the research phase, which is to the kind of mid-August, which leads into the community survey. So that was released on Monday to the community. We put a post on the Town of Canmore's Facebook page to announce that that's been released. Also sent through a bit of an email to those who signed up to receive email updates on the initiative to let them know that the survey is now live too. And we've seen 119 responses so far. So hoping to have all of you, we sent through a bit of a template that you can send out to all your contacts through email. So if you can push out that message, that would be great that it's open. It will be open until Friday, August 6th. So a couple more weeks for people to get their responses in. Public workshops, so as I said, July 7th, we had 58 registered and actually had 40 participate, which was great, only a few drop-offs. And then our last workshop is, I can't believe it's already our last workshop, is next week on Thursday. We have 61 people registered so far, and we'll know how many people participated after that session. And we've had 6 task force members volunteer to be note takers. Everyone did a fantastic job. Even if technology wasn't on your side, you did a great job. If there's anyone that's interested in being a note taker for the last session, we have 1 or 2 spots still available. So let me know. You can send me an email if you'd like, or just let me know anytime during the session as well. We have scheduled a workshop with some participants from the Affordable Services Program through the Town of Canmore. So we capped it at 20 participants, and we've had 20 participants register already, with a couple people on the wait list should we have a couple of drop-offs as well. So that will be on Tuesday of next week. It's a 2-hour session in the evening. And we're looking forward to that, hopefully getting a bit more of a diverse crowd. And then Indigenous engagement is going well. So we've had interviews with 2 elders, 2 tourism operators, and 2 youth. And it was through that interview with the youth that it came to our attention that we should be trying to put together a bit of a community gathering, even if that is virtual, that would allow youth to participate, community members to participate, elders to participate as one whole group. And so we're working with those 2 individuals to try and get something organized before mid to end of August. So we're working on that. Hopefully that can come to fruition, because I think that would be a really fruitful experience and get a lot of insight from. And then working with Métis Region 3 to get some interviews connected with some of the community members from them as well. And then, yeah, just a few more ongoing engagement. I have a call with someone from the Blackfoot Confederacy tomorrow or Monday, I can't remember, to try and figure out some ways in which they can participate as well, potentially getting them involved in the workshop next Thursday. And then put a message out to the Tsuut'ina to see how they would want to participate as well. And then, as we talked about last time, our interviews are complete. So we did that in May, as well as the youth workshop. So quite a bit of research that we've done so far. I still have a couple more things to go, but it's been really insightful through all the various initiatives that we've done so far. So something that we didn't share last time was a breakdown of who we actually interviewed when we talked about the public interviews within the Town of Canmore. So provided just a bit of a list of who we in fact interviewed, and we'll send a copy of this PDF deck to you all as well, so that you have a bit of a chance to read through it as well. But we talked to, tourism operators. We talked to Xavier from CHLA. Talked to a representative from the Canmore Filipino Canadian Society. Talked to some people from Yellowstone, Yukon. So a pretty good mix of various industries and parts of Canmore to get a fairly good representation across the community. You've seen this graph before, so essentially just showing you where we are today. So finishing up the final workshop next week, and we have the community survey open until August 6th. At that point, it's essentially on us to start to do some analysis and synthesis of all the research that we've conducted over the last 3-4 months. And that's essentially when we'll be meeting next. So we've scheduled a meeting for Thursday, August 26th, where Philip, Jason, and I will share some of the key insights from the engagement that will then be used to inform the framework, which will be the next presentation we make to you after this one. Any questions?
I have one. I was just curious, Nicole, if you can, and I know our time is short, but can you give us just the flavor of or some indication of what you're substantively what you're hearing in the Indigenous engagement meetings?
Philip?
Yeah, I think a quick way to look at that is when we drafted that survey for the community, we did 2 key things coming out of the research. So the first one was we said, what are the values that are really rising to the surface that people think should drive it? So every value in there came 100% out of the community engagement. And the second one we did is we broke out all of the ideas for vision into individual fragments rather than the complicated 5 or 6 item things that came together, and looked at those one at a time that came in. And those are 2 really important parts of what we got out of the engagement so far. But to be honest, Mace, that's all we've analyzed. All we've done is go into those 2 sections and pull out of it. We haven't done a dive across everything else that comes together. But it really does start to capture major themes. And so I imagine we'll see that percolating through the other stuff as well. But those 2 questions were very specifically built out of an analysis of the engagement to date. And we'll be looking very carefully to see if we get something new.
I'm not sure, Philip, I understand. I think Mace is asking about Indigenous engagement in particular. And are you saying the values and vision is what you're also getting out of it?
Sorry, Carol, sorry, Sally, I misunderstood your question, Mace. The Indigenous stuff is in there too. And so I'll just give you an interesting example. One of the very influential interviews I did in the Indigenous community talked about tourism as a teacher. I think that's a very interesting concept for us to consider about what tourism can be doing. A lot of the community talks about the educational value of tourism. So those 2 ideas are connected and something we can explore later on as they get together. So there would often be resonance coming out of our interviews with the Indigenous community that tied very much into what we heard from the public community, just articulated from a slightly different perspective. So at this stage, just kind of noting those 2 points and not diving into exactly what do we do about that later on. We'll sort of get a sense as to whether that idea resonates through the community survey a little bit of a larger level. So, but as I said, we've really only dived into those couple of elements. And the one I would add didn't come up a lot, but I think it's very viable. I found it very interesting that in this project, we often talk about borders between places in a very geographic context. Like Exshaw runs to a certain place, Canmore runs to a certain place, we run up to the national park boundary. Like they're very specific, yet with the Indigenous members we've spoken to, they view it almost as layers that overlap on top of each other. There's just a different conception of what boundaries are. And when we ask ourselves the question, how big is a tourism area around Canmore, we're never going to be able to answer it with a boundaries type question. We're probably going to need to take a more Indigenous point of view in doing that. So that's a personal point of view on it, Mace, rather than sort of an official answer. But that's, I think, an example of how our thinking is really being stretched and benefiting from the different perspectives we're getting.
And I'll just add to that, speaking with the 2 youth, the kind of big things that were talked about were the amplifying of Indigenous voices and artists, specifically for Morley within the town of Canmore, and how to be able to do that. Instead of going to outside sources, like finding someone else from elsewhere in Canada to display their artwork, or there's so many incredible artists within Morley that should be seen and amplified. And then also the land is and the environment was such a big part of their conversation of how can we be good stewards of the land and take the land in consideration as we look to grow tourism. So those are two kind of key themes that definitely came from the youth voice, at least the two individuals that we spoke with.
Now that we're on a roll, Nicole, one other thought is the jobs value of tourism has come out louder in the Indigenous interviews I've done than in the community consultation. It's almost as if the economic value is a little bit taken for granted in the Canmore community, whereas in the Indigenous community, it's seen as a really important opportunity, a really important thing to be part of, to benefit from, to serve the community through that. And it's just kind of interesting to say, because we've sometimes said, well, where's the tourism business in the dialogue? And it is a little bit quieter, but it was actually a little bit louder in some of the Indigenous interviews that we've done. And that wasn't just the Indigenous tourism operators who clearly have a business perspective, but some of the other community members as well.
Thanks. That's what I was trying to get at, so that's helpful.
Yeah. So there you go. All of which we reserve the right to disagree with in a month when we come back to you, but that's what we're hearing so far.
Any other questions?
Go ahead, Jody.
Just wondering why you've kept the conversation with the affordable group at 20. If you've got 22 people signed up, is there a reason why you're not talking to 22?
It was primarily just for budget reasons. So it's just based off of the budget, what we worked with. So I've created a wait list because there will be a couple people that will generally drop off. So we'll still have 20.
It's not a matter of 20 versus 21, it's 20 versus 50. So, and
just so everybody knows, this workshop is an add-on. So we had two staff who went to the first session, and then we got in a conversation about how we can make the conversations we're having accessible to a broader, more diverse group. And it was our staff who suggested this affordable services group. And so it's an add-on to our work with Stormy Lake and wasn't part of their original proposal. So we've had to put some parameters around it based on the money we have left for this project.
We're really excited to talk to them. It's a layer of the community that we don't think is being well represented yet. So to have 20 of them in there, and 20 is a great voice. We're not concerned about what we're hearing out of 20 people. 12 people, I go, maybe not enough, but 20 is good.
Yeah, we'll have 3 solid breakout groups, which will be great. Anything else?
I was just saying to Rob, just as the call was starting, so some of you may have heard this, we're now at the transition point between gathering information to figuring out what to do about it. So as you see our heads turn a little bit, we've largely got the process of the engagement well in hand. And now we're really, what are we going to do? How are we going to bring value to you when we come to our next meeting? And so it's a really exciting part of the project as we move from one start to the next.
Michelle?
Yeah, so just a comment and about some of the sort of feedback I've been getting from the workshops, and just because I know we have one more to go, and it's all from friends who know friends who've been on workshops and that kind of thing. And I guess one of what's coming through from quite a few of these responses is some people are finding that the synopsis at the end is absolutely fantastic. Nobody knows how you guys can do that. But also, I guess quite a few people are saying that they're finding that the summary is glossing over a really big issue for a lot of local residents, which is the crowding and the just too many people. And because it's a given, it's kind of glossed over in the summary. And it's not sort of dealt with. So they're kind of, just again, this is what I've heard, is they're not feeling like maybe always that their voices were heard in the discussions they had, because that's what they talked about a lot. And then it's not there a lot in the summary. That, and also there's in the workshops that they were in their groups, lots of talk about ways to manage like the numbers and all that kind of stuff. And again, didn't seem to come through in summaries at the end. So anyway, it's just, I promised my network I would pass that on. And so there we go.
Yeah, I would say you're bringing up things that we're absolutely hearing. It's hard in a summary when you're trying to cover all the different kinds of things that were said to show any weighting of one issue over another. And overcrowding is certainly an issue. It's also tightly connected to people who are less upset about visitors and visitor behaviors. And
Well, yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
so
Tied
we're
together.
certainly seeing that as it comes through, and it will clearly be in the report. We've had to make a very conscious decision not to dive too much into those action recommendations because we can't do it justice in the time we have for the summary. So we're just showing a couple of examples of actions that come out, no analysis of the relevance and value of those. So we've just had to set them in because it's quite a bit of a time crunch as we go through.
I get, yeah. And I totally, and I think, and that was one thing I brought up with Sally on the survey too, is because I've heard we have so many people, intelligent people in this community, not saying my friends are intelligent, but, you know, like, what do you say that, you know, means of moving forward and managing tourism and education. Like there's all these awesome ideas that they did put forward in the workshops. And then, as you said, time crunch, and it's a whole nother ballgame. And so that's why I kind of put that idea forward on the survey where people had that opportunity to maybe voice that specific.
It's interesting because I know that we also try really hard to get representation across all of the groups. So when we have 7, 8 groups, you know, we've got really big numbers. We're trying to make sure that each group hears a small snippet of what they are. What I'm hearing you're saying is we mention that overcrowding, then they'll say, yes, I've been heard. But we're actually, you know, probably taking that as a given and trying to find those other insights. But I think your point is well taken.
Yeah, I totally agree with you that way. Because I mean, I worked for one and I saw that too, and it is a given. But I think just mentally, people they say, holy cow, like that's the biggest issue for a lot of us, and yet it was glossed over, even though they know that by not glossing over it, but it's just so prevalent, it's so out in your face that you don't need to talk about it. But anyway, I've done my duty, I have passed it on.
Starting with the youth, it's been dominant in every session.
Yeah, I knew that. Yeah. Anyway, I now I've done my duty. I don't have to tell them I didn't.
Well, we hear, we've heard the issues, and we'll certainly pay attention to the summaries in the last 2 sessions.
Okay, looks like there aren't any other questions.
Carol?
Any of you have any edits to the last minutes? Maybe you can just send them to me and we won't do any editing as a group. Sarah would have sent out the minutes from the June meeting. But Nicole or Philip or Jason, I'm wondering if one of you wants to introduce Lawrence. So it was really your reach out that led to him being here with us tonight?
Yeah. Lawrence Gervais is the regional president of the Métis Region 3 of Alberta. And he's been kind enough to share some of his time with us tonight and present some stories.
Yes, thanks for having me. So I'll just reintroduce myself. My name is Lawrence Gervais. I'm Métis on both sides, my mother and father. They're both from Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan. I'm my father's side, they're Gervais and Falcons. On my mother's side, they're Villeneuves and Aubuchon. They remember meeting each other when they were, I think, 6 years old, and my dad was 10 years old. And my mother remembers him carrying a record player down the street and noticing how odd he was. But they are still together. They are right now in a seniors home in Lloydminster on Saskatchewan side, a Métis seniors home. And very supportive of the whole family. I grew up in Métis housing, so I grew up amongst the Métis community since I was a baby, and very lucky to do so. There's a lot of Métis out there that, you know, are sort of going through the process now of finding who they are and their culture, and I've been lucky to sort of have been through that already. I have 2 5-year-old twins, so if you do hear them in the background, they are playing quite heavily right now, but that's their mode, especially in late afternoon. And I was a classical ballet artist for 16 years, toured with Alberta Ballet Royal Winnipeg Ballet and the National Ballet Canada. And when I retired, I received the National Aboriginal Achievement Award. And ever since then, I've been working in my community. I've done frontline service. I've been executive director for a number of friendship centers in Western Canada, as well as a 5-year service in the downtown east side in Maine and Hastings in Vancouver. So I've seen a lot of impacts to Indigenous communities. And I was also witness to the residential school hearings that were happened in, I think, 2016 now. No, 14, yeah, about then, 2016. I'm here to actually give you a bit of a presentation about the Métis Nation and how it relates to Southern Alberta. My job as regional president is to represent 15,000 members here in the South, as well as the 43,000 who self-identify as Métis. So our numbers are quite high, but we're still sort of figuring out where our place is. Is it okay if I share my screen? Can I? Oh, perfect. Now, I'm not going to go from year to year starting at 1608 to 1885, but certainly we'll rush through this as best I can, so people at least have an understanding of our community. So as we know, when the first contact came, it was in 1497. That's when they claimed Labrador. But really, the fur trade started to begin in 1535 when many of our marriages first started happening. What we called them were trade unions. So certainly the idea from the Bras Boulets in northern France when the fur trade was ending had come over with their same customs here. And that was to sort of marry into the families, the Indigenous families. There was a high benefit for it in terms of survival, especially during the hard months of winter, and also the kinship. So fur traders would also, provide these networks, thereby ensuring that First Nations people were taken care of also amongst the economics. So this is something that we, and then of course the children from that became the country born and the mixed blood. Certainly that's not what the Métis Nation bases itself off, but certainly we have the ancestry directly from those marriages. Rupert's Land Hudson's Bay Charter began in May 2nd, 1670. So you ever see Hudson's Bay Company, the Bay, that certainly is active still to this day. It's one of the longest companies serving North America for quite since then, and they're still using the same logo. But it was predominantly related to those hats, those beaver hats. I probably wouldn't wear one to this day, but certainly back then they were very, very popular, and they all had different names. But the prime furs that we had here in North America were brought over there and certainly prepared, and that was part of their dress. But Rupert's Land and Hudson's Bay Charter, excuse me, my camera fell. When it was established in 1670, stated that the Hudson's Bay Company was to control all the lands, rivers, and streams into the Hudson's Bay, an area of 1.5 million square miles. So you can see that territory in the yellow covering this territory. The territory covered 40% of modern day Canada. Hudson's Bay Company was certainly operating in the fur trade from 1670 to 1821. And as you can see, it's also the base of the divide. So they knew exactly how far the mountainsides were going. So from the Great Laurentian and the Arctic specifically, that was the watershed that they used for Hudson's Bay. And that was the agreement that they used. You can kind of see it going into the States and up above. So really that was the trade area, and Hudson's Bay Company, which is still operating through the present. The first known, certainly York Factory was the big fur trading fort that was first established because they went through the channel up in the north into Hudson's Bay, and that was predominantly where the first fort was in 1684. And by then there was about 4 generations of mixed blood. And And then where Red River Settlement is in Winnipeg, that's where the first settlement was in 1692. So they went directly south to compete with the river systems to be able to travel all the way down to as far as New Orleans. And the first settlement at the Forks was the Assiniboine. And how this relates to Southern Alberta, it actually does, because that was kind of the settlement area, and people would work the land all the way into Alberta and then head back. And it would take about a year of work. They would travel over to the mountainside and then travel back to where they were at the Red River Settlement. Sorry if I'm going really fast, but I know I'm just, I know I have a time constraint. So the hiring contract is pretty normal for a Hudson's Bay employee. It was a 1 to 2 year service. What they would do is they would come over from Europe, certainly have these trade unions and these marriages, be done with their contract, and end up moving back to Europe with leaving the petites behind, as they were called. So 1 beaver would get you about half a pound of beads. What's interesting is 12 beavers got you 1 gun. About 8 balls of shot was for 1 beaver. 20 fish hooks for 1 beaver. So that was kind of the trade value on a lot of these items. And then of course the marriages, there weren't a lot of churches in those days. So the marriages were conducted by the company. They were considered as valid as if bound by clergy. We still use those records to this day. It became customary to leave the Indian women in the native land and support them with a pension. The pension was given to the petites, a sum of money that was withheld from the wages. And then all that was kept on the books also. Métis people in the past have been called majority of these things. So Coureur de Bois, Voyageurs, Bras Boulés, mixed blood, burnt wood people, which just meant we just had a different color to us. They call them scorched wood also. Children of the fur trade, children of Hudson's Bay, flowered beadwork people, which you know, kind of relates to the garments that we wore. We would use a real European style dress, jackets, but then we would decorate in these flowered beadwork. And then Otopimisawak, which means the people who own themselves, free men, you know, individuals who sort of, we have a desire to be free, and we don't want the government to really take control of us type thing. And that word was given to us by the Cree. And then half-breed, French breed, Scotch breed, and English breed. These are the government terms they used in the census. So censuses went around, they would check you off as a half-breed. And then right next to those boxes, they would check you off as French breed, Scotch breed, or English breed. So there's a predominant way of thinking that we're all French Métis, but we're not. We have Scotch Métis, and we also have English Métis in our blood. Country born, which I've already explained. Michif is our sort of cultural term that we used in a Métis word that we've for language, and one that is specific to Métis people. Some of us still use that term. The real traditional people call themselves Michif to this day. And road allowance people. So that was certainly after the impacts of colonization and 1885 rebellion, we were placed on the road allowance. So road allowance basically is that 25 meter from road to the fence line. And you'll see it on today, you know, when you're driving down a road. That was the only place that we could actually live. There was no agreement once the script system was put in with Métis people, where we could reside, and it was all in the road allowance. And I'm sure some of us who've been around, because the last one was in 1970, has probably seen people living basically on the ditches. Our land blood lies with the Cree, Assiniboine, the Saulteaux, Ojibwe, and the Chippewa. So these are predominantly the marriages that took place. And the women from those communities who had the offspring with the Europeans, they're the ones that have been there for thousands of years. We're a community based on kinship, European male and First Nation females, and all Métis people blood run for thousands of years. In 1759, Britain defeated France on the Plains of Abraham, which I'm pretty sure everybody knows. The Roval Proclamation was made. By that time, there were 7 generations of mixed blood in the territory in west of the Appalachian Mountains. But the Roval Proclamation, clearly recognized that Aboriginal people as nations. This is what treaties are made from. Also, they're based on the Roval Proclamation. So if you hear of things like UNDRIP and those things in our current dialect that Canada talks about, UNDRIP sort of reenacts that Roval Proclamation into legislation. Then Hudson's Bay Company had a rival company called Northwest. They came in, they were predominantly a Scotch led company with investors from Montreal. So there was a French and Scottish company that competed with the Hudson's Bay Company. And what they would do normally is put the Hudson's Bay Company forward that was already there and established. They would come into the territory and put a Northwest Company right beside it. And we can see that in Rocky Mountain House if people have ventured off up there. You'll see a company in the sort of the same realm. And that's how they competed. And then, of course, our Michif language was established. This is a Michif Lord's Prayer, 8 generations of mixed blood at this point. So even our trading language, and that's predominantly what Michif was just an amalgamation of many different languages. And a lot of Métis people spoke a lot of different dialects. So a lot of French nouns with the describing words basically in a traditional language. So Cree, Dene, Ojibwe, just Swampy, like just different dialects all mixed into one. This is the first known sort of person coming into Southern Alberta he was a Hudson's Bay Company explorer out of York Factory. He was here in this territory in 1792, is known. But he was also known to be here even as a teenager to vacation. He would come by himself. At this time when he was an explorer, he had a team of Métis that were around him, even his wife, who was Swampy, Mary Macagon. She has a lot of descendants in this community. But they met with the Sisu near Battle River, which is near Red Deer. Traded max with the Beekani and at Highwood River. First European to meet with the Kootenai, so he's traversed over the mountains. The big one is he discovered coal and drumheller, discovered raw bitumen in Athabasca. So he's been all over Alberta, even before there was significant settlement. And certainly was documented by Hudson's Bay Company. So when fur trade ended, they went into the railway business, freighting, started to get into farming. Investors started to invest in certainly Hudson's Bay Company's looking at his diaries, knowing exactly where all these natural resources were in Alberta. York boat is another invention of the Métis. It had an ability to traverse, through very narrow waterways. Métis always look at the waterways as significant travel routes for us, and could have put a sail on it. They would take everything out, pack it, and then portage that boat directly over the land, and then keep going. So a lot of Métis people pride themselves on how much they can lift, and that's one example of one of their ships. And then, of course, significant a little bit to Southern Alberta is 1799 Rocky Mountain House, and then Acton House being there positioned at the same time. And like I said, everybody can kind of go there and see. I have an ancestor that worked at both companies at this site, John Baptiste Gervais. And then the Red River cart. By this point, there's 9 generations of mixed blood working. So those were all made of wood, no metal. So they're squeaky. They also had wooden parts. So if one part broke, you could just go in the bush and make another one and keep going. You could take the wheels off, put it inside and use it as a raft. This was the very first freighter, because along the cart trails, they could tie as many as 100 to 200 carts together and just transport goods that way too, just like one big long freight train. and very useful to use. And then those wheels, they could certainly cross a river quite easily. And then, of course, we all know about David Thompson going through, the area of House Pass. He had given that name to Joseph House. So he crossed the mountains from Rocky Mountain House to the Columbia River, but just traveled all the way down and traded with the Kootenai on the other side of the mountains. And that was his passage. He had 10 children, 3 were born along the passage. So you can imagine all your kids in your canoe and in the open prairies and through mountains. It's definitely must have been a very unique time for them. And was married to Charlotte Small. So Joseph House, Acton House, he was positioned there, and at Rocky Mountain House, and that's who House Pass is named after. He explored flathead country for HBC, and Jane House's grandfather. So where Jane House resides at Heritage Park, before that, obviously it was Heritage Park, she purchased that land, that property with her scrip money, and that's her grandfather. He became a predominant politician in the Red River settlement. This is the story of how the Métis Nation was kind of born. We were born because Hudson's Bay Company, Northwest Company started to have issues with settlers starting to come into the Red River settlement that weren't working with the companies. And it was the first sign that really, colonial people from Europe were coming just to settle. And this certainly was creating a lot of unrest. And because of that unrest, the companies started to fight with one another, because it's almost like when you throw things in the middle of them, they start to tackle one another. And the Métis were kind of caught in the middle. The Pemmican Proclamation kind of warned the Métis if they help the Hudson's Bay Company, they'll take their food away. And as a result, the Métis protested by barricading and began raiding forts. And this was kind of how we based the founding of the nation. A lot of people have a presumption that it was around Louis Riel's time, but it was definitely in 1816. So we were given a flag by the Scotland to use as a recognition for all our hard work for Northwest Company. That blue flag was what we believe is the real origin flag. But then we have a lot of Métis that stand on the other side. They say the Selkirk papers tell us it was the red flag that was written first. But as you can see, in those days, especially during the Civil War, there was the red versus the blue, and we stood on both sides. And that's 10 generations of mixed blood. Then the Battle of Seven Oaks began. So when those Selkirk settlers were coming in and creating this unrest, that's when sort of things started to happen. And the Métis from the Northwest Company, led by Cuthbert Grant, seized the supply of pemmican. Robert Semple met us and fired a shot at us, and the Métis outnumbered them 3-1 and killed 22 of their men. This hit the press. This was a huge deal for people that were living in that area. They all went to Montreal, and everybody was sorely, the trial was ended in acquittals, and Cuthbert Grant Jr. was released. And when he was becoming released, he talked about the new nation. He talked about the new Métis being their own government. This is an ancestor of mine, Pierre Falcon, direct, and he's wrote the first Métis Nation anthem. And it was certainly a song about what he witnessed at that victory at Frog Plain. And people call it the Battle of Seven Oaks. And Cuthbert Grant Jr. Was named Captain General of the Métis, Battle of Seven Oaks, and then was also in 1828 as being exonerated, was given the Warden of the Plains and the Member of Council of Assiniboia and Justice of the Peace. And then in 1818 to 1821, 1 year before the fur trade ended, W.B. Coltman Report established that the Métis were innocent of the crimes, exonerated all of us, and reported that the Selkirk settlers took the first shot. And Hudson's Bay Company, Northwest Company merged together in one, and in 1821. And that's when we started to see that the fur trade was ending. And these Métis individuals that worked for both companies became free men. And then in Grantown, St. Francois Xavier, White Horse Plain. This was the very first generation of Métis in terms of settlement. People would know the Métis that lived there as the ones who had a big battle with our First Nations in the Sioux one specific at the Grand Coteau battle. But the ones that really were the most active in any of the roles politically back then. Then the Beaufort was, and what had happened was there's a lot of free men that were walking all over Western Canada, still working as much as they could with furs and could sell and profit from them directly. And 100 of them actually built the Beaufort, which sits on the Morley Reserve, including my ancestors that were there. And that was in 1832. So about 50 years before Calgary was here, about 30 plus years before Canada was even a nation in this territory. So shortly after, the Cree battled the Blackfoot at Nose Hill, and the Beaufort only lasted 2 years, but there's still a few remnants that are there. I think there's a few chimney stacks and stuff like that. In 1837, the Papineau Rebellion, Patriot. So this is the story of when Louis Riel started to begin his sort of resistance. And it was through his dad. His dad was witness to the Papineau Rebellion. So this was the Civil War that almost happened in Quebec, in Canada, and about 1837, 1838. And that flag was actually legal to fly anywhere sort of west or east of Quebec. And Louis Riel Sr. brought that to the Red River and had a, how you say, he honored the French at that time and brought that teachings to the Red River. Métis buffalo hunters, we're pretty serious about our hunting. So predominantly when the fur trade ended, we moved into the buffalo trade. And we operated our own trading camps. We even had one that was close to Airdrie in Crossfield, for instance, where we traded furs. But 10 captains, 10 soldiers, 10 guides. We also had rules of the hunt. So no buffalo to be run on the Sabbath day. No person or party to run buffalo before the order. I'm just skimming through. Certainly if there was an issue with the laws, you'd had your saddle and your bridle cut up, which, for survival, especially with having your horse, that would have been very, very tough on you. The offenders, sometimes your coat would be taken off your back, cut up. You were flogged, which means you were whipped. And certainly if your name was called out 3 times as a thief in the middle of the camp, that was certainly something that was bad also. But when Canada was born, and one of the reasons why we always refer to this date is July 1st, 1867, is because most of the agreements that were done by Louis Riel always reference this day as the day one, once Canada proclaimed it's the Dominion of Canada. We've had about 3 generations of Métis at that point. And when there were surveyors on that stepped onto the Nault, Andre Nault's farm in Red River and put their surveyor chains down, Louis Riel ran up to and put his foot down and said that you have no legal right to be here. And that's when the Red River resistance began. And also they styled themselves as the Patriots. He set up his own government right away, November 16th, 1869. So right after the chain was done, convention of 24. So he had 50% English and 50% French representatives. And that provisional government established itself on November 24th. And HBC signed the deed of transfer for the territory on November 19th, 1869. so a little bit late, and then McDougall's proclamation. So we're talking, at least 3 or 4 months after Louis Riel set up his own government, McDougall finally showed up and annexed the territory in the name of Canada, which was highly offensive to the Métis. And also John A. Macdonald postponed it. And this is when it created all the unrest in the Red River. So in terms of consultation, they didn't do as much as they really should at the end of the day, and just declared it as Canada's, which upset a lot of people here in Western Canada. So we all know what would happen after that. Then the Red River Resistance. So Donald Alexander Smith, and we all know him as Lord Strathcona, Mount Royal, the individual who drove the last spike at Craigellachie, BC. He approached Riel to discuss terms in 1870. Thomas Scott, a leader in the Orangemen, choked Riel. Council members decided to execute him. Riel showed him mercy, March 4th, 1870, which we all know in Ontario, they decided to create an army to extract the Métis out of the Red River. Even though John A. Macdonald, agreed to sit with the Métis. But as a result anyways, Manitoba Act was established in May 12th. This gave us the Manitoba as a province, specifically a Métis province, what they sort of had an ideal for. English and French rights were safeguarded. Protestant and Catholic rights were established. 1.5 million of acres of land were set aside for the children of the Red River. Métis received 4 seats in Parliament at that time. So you can see the postage stamp on the far right. So that little white area on the bottom, what they called Manitoba, was all reserved for the Métis as part of their agreement with Canada, which has all been signed and certainly legislated and gone through what it needed to do at that time. But then, shortly after Red River Expedition, and because of the Thomas Scott's execution, they arrived at Lower Fort Garry to extract Riel in 1870, and Louis Riel fled to Montana via the Milk River here in Alberta. That was his route into the States. Then the Métis dispersal begins. So 1870 to 1872, we started to see Métis families sort of traveling west into southern Alberta. So Our Lady Peace Mission is kind of our very first contact for significant space for us, and everybody knows where that is. It's near Bragg Creek, just north of Bragg Creek. There is a cairn that still sits there, and it outlines that this was the place that Métis Alexis Cardinal built a log cabin, and he was instructed to build 3 parishes, and that was the first one. And that same cabin and parish has been moved all the way to the Bow and Elbow at some point in time during the 1870s. In 1875. Then it was used as a Hudson's Bay Company trading fort in that area. So where the Bow and Elbow sit right now. And it was a historic site labeled as that. Then the very first couple that kind of settled, so people know where Fish Creek Provincial Park is located. John Glenn and Adelaide Belcourt, who were Métis. That was 1873. So Calgary wasn't really established until 1884. So as you can see, there was people moving into the territory. Everyone knows about Morleyville, I'm sure, or have heard of it. When McDougall family showed up, they definitely brought their company members, so who a lot of them were Métis that moved into the territory also. Then Fort Macleod. Fort Macleod was founded in 1874 with the arrival of the Northwest Mounted Police. A lot of people have an idea, and certainly the police now, and I know the RCMP Foundation had recognized 5 Métis members that helped assist the force move into the territory. And then Inglewood, which is in downtown Calgary, is kind of known as the very first Métis neighborhood, or certainly Hudson's Bay Company neighborhood. And a lot of the employees that worked had built the Dean House, the Hunt House, the Rhubarb Patch, which is now the seniors' home, the Calgary Brewery, and they had lent a hand to Fort Calgary too. So Sam Livingston and Jane House, who House Pass is named after her grandfather, first settled at the Fort Calgary site, but then they were moved to what is now Heritage Park. And what they moved them basically where the Glenmore Reservoir Dam is. And then when they flooded the area, they had moved them up the hillside to where Heritage Park is. The land was purchased by Jane House's scrip money. Then shortly after that, the Indian Act was established. So we go back to the First Nations, and one of the differences between us and First Nations is that the Métis had fought against becoming a part of the Indian Act. So the Indian Act established over time the Gradual Civilization Act, and that's what it was based on. So even those two words in that title kind of tell you where the government was headed in terms of legislation. Then the Gradual Enfranchisement Act, and then these were consolidated to establish the Indian Act in 1876. So the Indian Act's prime goal was to assimilate Indian people into Canadian settler society. This legislation over time restricted band powers, implemented Indian agents, marginalized women, limited participation in rituals and ceremonies, did not allow legal representation, did not allow anyone to vote, decided residential school participation, and determined who would be eligible for band and treaty benefits. And I'm sorry if I look like I'm jumping around, but I'm actually going on a timeline. So everyone kind of sees how settlement was starting to happen in Southern Alberta. So this is within, 1870 to 1885 when Louis Riel was gone, and then he came back again. Kind of things that happened in sort of Western Canada. So we all have heard about Sir James Lougheed, Lady Isabella Hardesty. They have those titles given to them. They attend, for instance, Lady Isabella Hardesty attended Miss Matilda Davis School at St. Andrews on the Red River. This was a school that was made up for Hudson's Bay Company employees, where they could bring their young girls to. They were groomed there into marriages with European, which was a common practice for a lot of these schools back then. She also attended the Wesleyan School in Hamilton, served on the National Council of Women. She was also in the local chapter of the Imperial Order of the Daughters of the Empire. And her family were all the chief factors in Hudson's Bay Company, specifically her uncle, who was Richard Hardesty, who was very well known in Hudson's Bay Company territory back in those days, and was the first one to negotiate with Riel. And well, what's interesting about this couple is Sir James Alexander Lougheed made profit, quite heavily with real estate in terms of what was handed over from the scrip from the Métis. And then, of course, his wife, who's predominantly Métis herself and knew many of the families. We could imagine all the stories they had certainly at the dinner table. So I know they're making a feature documentary right now about this specific family. And then, of course, Peter Lougheed, his relation, he's a direct line to this. And, we have a very great relationship with the Lougheed House and we talk about the old histories, and they've, given us the gift to go ahead and begin telling their stories. So this is one of the very first things that we outline to a lot of our young people, so they understand that there was Métis on both sides. Not all Métis were supporters of Riel, right? And that's another thing that we sort of have to abate through our history. So Marie Rose Delorme, a Métis, Charlie Smith. So we all know Donald Alexander Smith. She was married into the family. She was traded in 1877 at the age of 16 for $50. There is a book called The $50 Bride. She gave birth to 17 children. They settled in Pincher Creek at the Jug Handle Ranch, and she was also a medicine woman. And she authored Old Time Home Remedies. She also published several articles for the Canadian Cattlemen. She was there to witness many of the roundups that happened in the Porcupine Hills. And then we get to 1883, so 2 years before the next rebellion and about 5 years before Calgary. He had settled Baptiste Finesse. His property, homestead, is where the Saddle Tomb currently sits. Then Calgary Zoo parking lot is where Cuthbert McGillis's his homestead was. And this is 1 year before Calgary was even built. You can, in CPR maps, we get a lot of information as Métis folks from CPR maps. They were very accurate on the detail. It shows the cart trails, it shows the homesteads. So this is 1 year before Calgary was incorporated. And as you can see, there was quite a bit of settlement here from a lot of Métis. And at this point, there was 4 generations of Métis in this territory. So what's significant is where the Fort Calgary building is. I think that's the wrong side. Oh no, that's right. That's where Fort Calgary is. There's the Hudson's Bay Fort there. And then Métis, Baptiste Danus, Napoleon Mayette, Paul Fayon were well-known buffalo hunters. That land grant was given to the Francophone as a promise. And there was Métis also within that territory, which is the Beltline in Calgary. Then in 1885, Gabriel Dumont was feeling unrest in northern Saskatchewan. He traveled to Montana through the Milk River, convinced Riel to represent their interest in Saskatchewan, and Riel agreed to come back, and they quickly formed a provisional government. Then the Northwest Rebellion came. This was the beginning of the dark years for First Nations and Métis. So the Battle of Duck Lake, Gabriel Dumont's brother was killed there by Northwest Mounted Police. And that's what sparked a lot of the unrest for Métis specific. Then the looting at Battleford, which was a First Nations, Frog Lake Massacre, First Nations, Battle of Fort Pitt, First Nations, Métis battle at Fish Creek, and then we battle at Cut Knife, and then of course the Métis last stand at the Battle of Batoche in May 9th. This is what after Louis Riel was captured and brought to Regina to be tried for treason. So people kind of know those dates, I'm sure, that there's a lot of history there. I had ancestors, one ancestor that's buried at Battle of Batoche, Donald Ross, who had killed one of the captains in the Canadian Army through a windowsill and was shot in retaliation and buried there. Every year we have a festival at Batoche, and there's a church there with all the national park is there that people can go for free and go take a look. So very significant place for us in history. There's some prisoners there. And then shortly after, Donald Alexander Smith, who over time, within those 15 years, had gained a lot of title. And he was the commissioner, governor, and principal shareholder of Hudson's Bay. So he did profit there. Actually, his brother was the president of Bank of Montreal and co-founded the Canadian Pacific Railway. Those are very important because at that time, CPR was struggling for cash, and to have quick ties to a bank, he could definitely fund himself. Canadian High Commissioner, United Kingdom. So a lot of people, not only the royal family called him Uncle Donald, but he was known throughout the land as that. Chairman of Burma Oil, so he, which was BP, he also had interest in development. Controlled the Manitoba Free Press, so he certainly had a say on how narratives were told back then, and a lot of people relied just on the newspaper alone. Lord Strathcona resided in the Golden Square Mile in Montreal, so very affluent at this point. And he drove the last spike in Craigellachie on November 7th, 1885, just shortly before Louis Riel was hung for treason on November 16th, 1885. So as you can see, as a result of certainly Riel's, living in Montana for 15 years. He was also a volunteer for the Republican Party. He was an American citizen. Which was another thing that, Canada, we're trying to, redress with them so they understand. And then his letters to the White House that were completely ignored at that time. And also the normal routine would that they would extradite a US citizen back to their country, but this was obviously for political reasons. And he died. And this is when I talk about the Scrip Commission, so people understand what that is. There's no T on Scrip, it's just Scrip. And you could trade what had happened when Canada encroached and moved over, they made Métis people who were living on the land to reapply for those sections. And 96% of those applications were denied. But you can exchange, you had a choice between a coupon for money, $160, or you had to apply. Right, and that was basically the system they set up. So, we have a lot of Métis lawyers in our community that call it the largest land swindle in North America, and a lot of these titles that go out there, and people are starting to write books about Scrip. But Canada and us, even in our Métis Nation Accord that we just signed with the Prime Minister, we have a clause in there that we have to address what happened with Scrip. But that Scrip coupon that was given to Jane House, she used that money to purchase that area where Heritage Park is. So, immediately after 1885 rebellion, they enacted the pass system on First Nations. So First Nations needed a pass to be able to leave the reserve. This is how they would separate us and the Métis. Sorry, First Nations and the Métis. By using the system. So the 1951 wasn't that long ago for them when they're allowed to leave freely. And that's when the Friendship Centers were kind of born around that time too, because, a lot of them just went to the urban centers and they needed an organization to kind of help with them adjust to urban life. So the pass system was there for them. And then for us, like I said, the road allowance, that didn't end until 1970. So the generation that's above me, certainly were a part of that. And because of the Scrip and the land title, once that your application was turned away, you couldn't go back to your original homestead. You only had really one choice to reside, which was just on the side of the roads. And if you were asked to leave, you had no choice. So this is a little story about the residential schools. I actually had this in my presentation for about 3 or 4 years now, before certainly the grave sites now, but it kind of gives you a context of what had happened. Residential schools were compulsory from 1894 to 1920. They were deemed as essential. This is a picture of my grandmother's class, and she's in that picture. And this was in Isle of Cross, and she went to a day school. Then the Bryce Report came in 1907. So the Dr. Peter Bryce visited 35 residential schools. He found that the schools were poorly ventilated. Conditions at that time spread tuberculosis and other diseases. He certainly amassed 1,537 pupils reported. Nearly 25% are dead, and that everywhere the almost invariable cause of death is tuberculosis. There was a survival rate of only 50% even when they returned home. Dr. Bryce made it clear that people running the schools, the churches, and the Canadian government were responsible for the health of these children. And as a result, in 1913, Duncan Campbell Scott suspended the funding for Bryce's research on child's death in residential schools and blocked all of Dr. Bryce's presentations. Then as a result, the Canadian government made it legislated that it was mandatory that, that children needed to attend residential schools. First Nations and Métis and Inuit. And then that, of course, didn't end until 1996. Here's a quote from the time of Minister of Indian Affairs, Duncan Campbell Scott, who was a poet back then, so he was a literary rep, but he said that he wanted to get rid of the Indian problem. Our objective is to continue until there's not an Indian that has been absorbed into the body politic, and there's no Indian question and no Indian department. So as a result from all this, residential schools and the impacts of certainly colonization and what we deem, what we can kind of see veritable proof as our poverty, records in our data. And 27% of First Nation children, which I think is more than that, live in poverty. 23% of Métis, and the normal is around 11 or 12% that live in poverty. Indigenous children in Canada are 2.5 times more likely to live in poverty. Manitoba and Saskatchewan specifically, 2 out of 3 Indigenous children live in poverty. And Indigenous children trail Canada's children on measures of well-being, family income, educational attainment, water quality, infant mortality, health, suicide, crowding, and homelessness. Now, if I was to design programs, which I've done in the past, and as you can see, a lot of Aboriginal organizations there really focus a lot on those areas. For the Métis, in order to get a card, you need to pass a 10-part system. We do, the first step when you self-identify as Métis, you cross off that first box, and then the other 9 steps in order to determine that you cross out that section 35. And we call it the PALI test. And we currently do that here in Alberta. So that's our identification piece. Hirsakorn, of course, was certainly something that we talked to about the Alberta government quite a bit, especially for Métis here in the South. They always refer to this case as how they relate to programming and access to programs. So if you ever see me in the news and I'm really hypercritical about Alberta's take on people here, Métis specific people in the South, they always say that cabinet advises them of the Hirsakorn, and this is why. The MMF case versus Canada, Supreme Court, was decided on March 8th. So that 1.4 million acres of land that was distributed to Métis heads of families, to the children specifically, there were so many government delays and inadequate planning. This is something that MMF is currently talking to Canada about. So if people hear about that, but it certainly outlines the case for why those agreements with Louis Riel were so important. And then Harry Daniels versus Canada. So now with the Guerin case for First Nations in 1982, they've had fiduciary duty Canada had to the First Nations. Now the Métis now have that box checked for us. So that's why you'll see a lot of, there's a Canadian sort of project where it needs approval from Canada that they kind of say there is a duty to consult with Métis, and they base it on the Harry Daniels decision, which happened in April, which also triggered the 9124, the Constitution Act in 1867. So we were only really federally recognized from 1982, but now we go all the way back to 67. In terms of Métis rights, I show people this all the time. I'm almost done. We always talk about what we use in our case law most of the time when we're in court. And we still do talk about the Roval Proclamation. Now we have the 9124 trigger, so section 35. PALI, which is our identification piece. Our land piece is related to the MMF case. Daniels, which is fiduciary responsibility of all governments. TRC, which is the residential school, their work there, and UNDRIP, of course, which was currently adopted by Canada. So now day one for the Métis rights in Canada is 151 years, but how do we go back there? It'll never happen, but certainly now we have a working relationship with Canada. We currently have a Métis Nation Accord that was signed on April 13th. We meet 4 times a year with the Prime Minister. We discuss what our needs are and certainly talk about programs and funding options and things of that nature. We're the fastest growing Indigenous population. It's not because of we're having tons of births and we're virile people. It's just a lot more people are starting to identify and coming forward and getting their membership. So Alberta today accounts for 114,000 self-identified Métis for the Canada Census, but there are only about 38,000 MNA citizens. And my very last slide just kind of shows you the Métis footprint. So the top right Canada one with all the blue, that's considered the Métis homeland. So as you can see, we don't go outside of the blue in terms of our government. We do have, we have a MNBC, MNA, MNS, which is Saskatchewan, MMF, which is Manitoba, and MNO, which is Ontario. And then, but there's no representation currently at our Métis National Council for the northern states, even though we do recognize them. And then of course, Northwest Territories. And as you can see, Alberta, I'm Region 3, so I'm Southern Alberta. I have the largest land mass, but I have the second highest population. And of course, the 8 settlements up north, which none of the settlements are down in the south. And I think that's basically it as a picture of the Métis Nation. And I hope that helped everybody. We do call it the Northwest Métis Homeland, but we always go Métis Homeland for short. So when we do a land acknowledgement and we mention Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3, but if you added homeland to that land acknowledgement, we don't get offended with that. And I think that's it for me. Well, you're all still here.
Thanks, Lawrence. That was a lot to take in.
I know. Well, it's my second one today, so.
And well, thank you for making time to do it. Does anybody have any questions or comments for Lawrence?
Just whether the slides will be available to the group after tonight.
Yeah, I can do that.
Great.
It's quite a large file, so if I send it over, can somebody put it on the Dropbox or something like that for people to share, or do you have?
Yeah, Lawrence,
yeah,
I can do that. I can do that for you.
okay.
That would be great. Thank you.
I have a question. Oh, sorry, the sun is like shining right in my window. Thank you so much, Lawrence. That was very enlightening, because I think, like most people on the task force, we learned, little tidbits of Métis history in school, but it's really nice to get a more thorough understanding of Métis history and how that's affected the current relationship that our government might have with Métis. I'm just wondering, like, since we are a tourism task force for Canmore, I'm just wondering if you have thoughts on, like, how would you like to see this Métis history and knowledge integrated into tourism for a place like Canmore? Like what can we do with all of this information that you've shared with us tonight? Because it is so meaningful.
Well, I mean, you're pretty lucky to have Peter Lougheed Mountain beside you, and his family is out in the open now about being Métis and about their history. And I think that's important. And of course, the travel route into, through House Pass and the significant trade that happened there.
Yeah.
Certainly on the Morley side, which is close to the Canmore area where the Beaufort was, that was our prime location for traveling up to Rocky Mountain House and straight down to the Bow River. But they decided to build a fort in that very same spot where they came down.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's what it is. And then I think you're close to Banff, but we always try to pressure Banff to outline Mount Norquay, because that to us that's Mount Norquay was named after the first premier of Manitoba, who was Métis, and had visited that mountainside and was that's what it was named after. But I think it's understanding the names, and I think that footprint that would help us. And tourism too, certainly acknowledging that there are a lot of mountain Métis that live in Canmore even to this day. I'm sure a lot of people know who Brenda Holder is, and, you know, her ancestry, you know, being in the mountains for many, many years, and even up to Jasper. And, you know, we do have that cross section in our families too, and understanding that there were Métis that were just, you know, in the mountains, and that's where they resided.
Mhm. Thank you, that's helpful. I'm kind
And
of,
also Métis were also used as
Accessing all that.
interpreters, guides. We still are to this day too, but yeah.
yeah,
That's a great question, Sarah. Thanks. Anybody else? You go ahead, Carol.
Lawrence, again, thank you. That was a lot of information and well appreciated. The question I have is, again, relating to the tourism. Are you aware, again, how do we get the education? It's been mentioned before about at least recognizing names and renaming place. Is that moving forward? Are you aware that that might be moving forward in our Bow Valley area, putting more education on Métis names rather than settler names for environmental areas, mountains?
Well, the only one I know is the Squaw one. I know they're trying to change that. We do have a lawyer, a Métis lawyer that lives in Canmore herself, Jude Daniels, who's very active on that, you know, and speaking up about that. But, you know, in terms of renaming, we haven't really been consulted too much on it. You know, even Lac des Arcs was significant to us. That's why you'll see that little Métis flag on the island every once in a while. And I know the individual that puts that out there, who lives in Banff. But it's kind of, you know, where our little significant spots were. And we haven't really done any traditional land use or into any type of study really in that area, which might be another option for us Métis to really think about is, you know, obviously writing into a program and getting the money to actually do a study, a historical one.
Thank you.
Jude was successful, Lawrence. I don't know if you know, the Stony Nakota did a big ceremony and renamed that mountain to Bald Eagle Peak. And that was really,
Oh, that's great.
yeah, it was really because of all of Jude's work in setting that up. So lots out of there. Yeah. Okay, if nobody else has questions, Lawrence has 5-year-old twins who have not busted through yet. But Lawrence, thank you very much for coming. We really appreciate having you and for you sharing your significant wisdom and knowledge with us. And please know, I know it was through Stormy Lake that you were invited here, but you have an open invitation if there's anything that the Town of Canmore organization or community can do as you're figuring out your place and doing work. We are happy to be a partner and to hear from you anytime. So know that you're always welcome.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
And then we're gonna, Lawrence was really the main show for the evening. Mace did have added a last minute item in an email this morning from a conversation he's had with Indigenous Tourism Alberta. I'm wondering, Mace, if we could ask you to speak quickly to that.
Sure, I can just take, excuse me, a couple of minutes. And this may be of interest to the Stormy Lake team too, but I was introduced to Shay Bird, who is the CEO of ITA. And he was aware of the existence of the task force, didn't know much about what we were doing. So we had a chance to get together and chat. And I should say he would be interested in speaking with us. And I think it might be a valuable opportunity for us, and he could provide, I think, some interesting, I don't want to presume, but I think he could provide some interesting input to the work that the Stormy Lake folks are doing. But the theme, we spoke for a long time, He's only been in the position, I think, for a little while, maybe less than a year. But he had 2 or 3 themes that I thought were important to the task force and important to the work that we're doing and important perhaps to, what comes out of the work that we're doing with respect, of course, to Indigenous engagement. And just in brief, ITA, he said, is willing to engage in and tries to develop partnerships with municipalities like Canmore, tourism agencies, or marketing organizations like TCK, and to facilitate connections between them and Indigenous tourism businesses and operators. But interestingly, he said, that's the easy part. Wanting to do that is easy. By itself, it doesn't really mean anything. And what he sort of asked me, what the kinds of questions he was directing to the task force and to towns like Canmore, who are grappling with tourism issues and talking about how to integrate or how to create an Indigenous conversation as part of that process, he focused on intentionality. And he said he thinks it's really essential if we go down this road to understand and to examine our intentions in doing so. What are we looking to do by entering into these or trying to pursue these types of discussions? What do we want to achieve? Are we looking for a true collaboration? Or are we just, ticking the box? Are we just looking to enhance our own marketing by saying that, we can make connections to or have tourism offerings that involve Indigenous experiences? And he was very pointed in that. And I think one of the reasons was he said that since Kamloops, which is to say over the last month or 6 weeks, ITA has really been inundated with requests from places like Canmore and from local or regional tourism organizations looking to make a connection. And I think he felt, and I don't think it's cynical at all, I think it's probably real. He felt that there had been this response because people started to say, oh, well, geez, we ought to do something, ought to make it appear as if we're engaged, ought to make it appear as if we're paying attention to these issues now. So I think he was, I don't want to characterize it, but I will. I think he expressed some skepticism about some of those more recent overtures. And that's why I think he emphasized, you need to figure out what you want to do here before you come to me, or before you come to organizations like ours and ask us to help you do it. So I think that's one thing for us to think about. He also emphasized that he thinks that Indigenous tourism initiatives, like the kind that we talk about trying to engage with the Stoney Nakoda about, be Indigenous led. And he said one of the things that he encounters all the time is that municipalities or marketing agencies try to dictate they say what they want, right? These are the kinds of experiences we want you to provide for our, tourism marketing or our tourism framework, rather than turning it around and saying, well, what do you guys want? What do you think is important? What are you trying to bring out into the larger world about your community, your culture, your connection to the place, the land? That it has to start there. And so I think, an aspect of that he kept emphasizing was trust. And one of the things he said a couple of times was, talk less, listen more. And I think we've heard some of this in some of our engagement sessions, run by the Stormy Lakes folks, that, there's a tendency, he felt, and I think I've perceived it, to say what we want, rather than asking what the Indigenous communities want, what they wish for, how they would like to engage. So I found it a really interesting and challenging conversation. He's a really thoughtful guy. I think he would like to engage. And so we have to, again, I don't know how much time we have. I don't know what the opportunity will be in the time that we have left. He's in Calgary a couple days a week. He could meet, or he could do something on Zoom, the way we've been doing it. So I just wanted to throw that out there. I don't know if you guys know him or have been in touch with him. I certainly can be again. And I told him, we were meeting tonight. I spoke to him in the end of last week, and that I or somebody would get back to him if there was some interest. So.
So we know Shay quite well. We've worked with ITA in the past on previous projects, so happy to reach out to him as well and continue that conversation that you started, Mace, and see how we can engage them. Shay is a great voice, and so I think including them in some way is a great idea. I'm so happy to do that and kind of let the task force know how that goes.
Okay, I may circle back to him just to say we spoke. That you guys were, part of the conversation, that he will be hearing from somebody, if that's okay.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm happy to schedule. We can schedule a task force meeting and have Shay speak to us at any time. The next meeting is scheduled for the end of August, although Stormy Lake has the majority of that agenda already because that's when they're doing their first big sort of summary for us. So. I don't know if it would work to include Shay in that agenda. We could schedule another time to meet. I am a bit concerned and frankly, a bit embarrassed at the number of people who are not here tonight when we had a guest. And so I just wouldn't want to do that again and not have this number of task force members not show up and not tell us that they're not coming. So would want a bit of a commitment if we're going to ask somebody to come as a guest again. Go ahead. Was somebody saying something?
Sally, can you remind me a little bit about our process? Because I feel like it would be useful to hear from Shay and the ITA, but I'd like to hear from them once we have heard from Stormy Lake the results of the public consultation, because I feel like the input from the ITA will help us to formulate the recommendations that might address some of what comes out of the public consultation, but I'm not quite clear. So our next meeting in August, Stormy Lake is going to share all the things they've learned, and we're going to be like, oh, wow, amazing. And then what? And then what is the plan?
Yeah, great question. And the tentative plan is for a final, I'm going to say report, but Philip and I have been talking about it probably won't look like a typical report, but not really sure what it might look like, although Nicole and Philip and Jason certainly jump in on that. The mandate of this task force is to have something in front of this council before the election on October 22nd. So we will have some kind of final product that is largely around principles that this group sort of finalizes and then presents to council as the primary work of this group. There is a full, it's too bad Rachel's not here tonight, and she did let us know she couldn't make it. Tourism Canmore Kananaskis has a approved strategic plan around a whole bunch of the implementation things. I mean, they already identify problems with over tourism and problems with overcrowding and have a work plan to address all those things. So it's not, we don't need to solve those problems for them, but part of what our work was creating a framework and some principles that are meant to guide the community, including the industry, in what our approach to tourism is. So I don't know when the right time to engage ITA in that is. What you said sounded great to me, Sarah, but I'm not sure. I'm open to whatever works.
So I guess I just want to, like if we have a September meeting, that might be a good time to hear from the ITA, because to me, there's like a layered process of engaging and meaningfully working with our Indigenous communities. And I really appreciate what you heard, Mace, and what you relayed to us about it's important to ask the Indigenous communities what they want to do and how they want to be engaged in tourism, rather than us saying this is what we need and can you fill this need for us? But there is, like, I kind of see working with Indigenous communities for them to offer Indigenous-based tourism is actually, like, it's not as meaningful an engagement as, like, deeper down into the core is like, how are our Stony First Nation neighbors a part of our community? Like, we're not just, the storytelling is like low-hanging fruit, right? Like that's a cool thing to do. And it's cool for people to learn the history of the land through an Indigenous perspective. But the core is like, how are we one community? And how are we one community that works towards a common understanding of what we would like tourism to be in this valley? And to me, that is like, that's where the real meaningfulness and real engagement comes. I don't know if I'm articulating that very clearly, but I just kind of feel like the tourism is almost like a superficial piece. That's not actually at the essence of what I would like us to be as a community.
Well, I would just, I think I do understand what you're saying. And I think, again, I had one conversation with Shay, right? And the Stormy Lake people know him better than I, but a lot of what he talked about, Sarah, was not about tourism per se. It was about relationships, right? It was about, I think fairly, it was about suggesting that we, how shall I say it, the non-Indigenous participants in this process, spend some time thinking about how we engage and how we perceive other cultures, and whether we're willing to sort of accept other cultures on their own terms, rather than, as he put it, just being transactional and saying, here's what I need, right? So I think that gets a little bit to what you're talking about, and I think implicitly and actually overtly, that was one of the themes that he wants to explore.
Yeah, that I think, I would be very disappointed if at the end of this whole process, our recommendation is that we should have more Indigenous-led tourism initiatives or businesses. Like, that to me doesn't get at the community and the engagement piece. That's just like other business opportunities for people to pursue.
Yes, I hear you, Sarah. And the recommendations will go deeper than that, because we recognize, and what we've heard is having that deeper relationship and understanding the connection further. And so as we start thinking through those action items and the recommendations, that's very much top of our mind as well, is it can't just be this superficial, here's what we think we should do to get more Indigenous tourism businesses in the community. It has to go deeper than that for it to be successful. And also know that so we present the key findings to you all at the end of August. And that's just to give you kind of a snippet of what we've heard. And then from that, we'll create that framework, those principles. And we actually, our intention when we went to the Indigenous communities was saying, we want to hear from you, but we also want to provide you with our draft of our framework and our principles to get your feedback on that as well, to make sure that we heard you correctly. And so that's an important point, piece too, is we go back to them and say, this is what we heard, was this correct? Is there something that we've missed? So that there is a bit more depth to our engagement with them and our understanding of them.
Yeah, that makes sense, Nicole. Thank you very much. And thanks, Mace, for having that conversation with the ITA, because it's definitely given me some food for thought in terms of like, it's always good. These meetings are always good. They always make me revisit the ultimate question of like, what do I want tourism to look like in Canmore? And what do I see it being for our community? And I think there are a lot of people who are wondering what to do with all of the revelations of the children at the various Indigenous residential schools. But I think we really need to be very careful to make sure that we're not just doing something because this suddenly is apparent. It has to be meaningful. It can't just be like, oh yeah, there were some kids, so let's have a teepee set up and let's do a powwow once a year. Like that's not a meaningful thing, right?
Yeah, I'm quite sure the last thing Indigenous communities need is more action from white people.
Correct. Yeah.
Just to be really blunt. Go ahead, Michelle.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, I'm just throwing this out as an option then, if we're gonna get kind of a summary at our August meeting, could we, and then, as you were saying, Nicole, we're gonna pass that on to your Indigenous contacts that we have. Could we then have a meeting in September where we specifically hear back from a lot of those Indigenous representatives as well, including the gentleman from ITA? And then they can tell us whether we're looking at it from the white man's point of view. Are we doing the right thing, or?
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing is we can have both Mace and Stormy Lake follow up with Shay. And maybe Mace, you and Lisa DeSoto and I could have a bit of a chat at some point in August as well, just to hear more about your conversation and some, yeah, anyway. And then we can look at scheduling as many meetings as we need in September. That sounds like that'll work for folks based on what we've just heard from Mace and discussed.
Sure.
So we'll keep the August. I think Sarah already sent out an August 26th meeting for people's calendars.
Yeah.
Won't have another meeting between then and now, but we will have the survey and the workshop. And then Nicole, we could just add that. We can discuss it when we meet on a Friday and add an update around that to that meeting on the 26th.
Yeah.
It works?
Sounds good.
Okay. Thanks everybody for that. I echo the thoughts and thanks Mace for reaching out to Shay and for leading that conversation. Sarah's on vacation as well. Everybody at the town, like I swear I'm the only employee working at the town of Canmore right now. I'm kidding, but it feels like it. They're all off. So the actions, I have Stormy Lake and Mace both following up with Shay and discuss a presentation from him at the September meeting. And Mace, I wrote down that all non-Indigenous task force participants will spend time to think about our willingness to accept other cultures on their terms instead of just asking for what we need. So that will be the homework for all of us over the next month, and we'll put that in the minutes. Anybody have anything else? Oh, go ahead, Carol. And then Michelle.
It's quick.
Yeah, quickly, and I got the answer. I'm going back to the online survey. I had computer issues. I couldn't log in earlier. The online survey is available till August 6th. And the way people will know about it is it'll be in the newspaper. They go to my Canmore website. They do the survey. I briefly talked about what about other venues to advertise it. The farmers market, I was there today. Tourism Canmore Kananaskis, Rachel's group has a tent set up there. We talked about town of Canmore employees, volunteers, whoever going around with iPads like we do at World Cup days. Is there any plan to solicit? Because I didn't hear a title, and I am sorry. I don't know how many people have given information to Stormy Lake so far if you total up all the workshop participants. That must have been presented while I was trying to get back on the computer. So I'm always a numbers person. I'm trying to get as many people in Canmore to participate. And I don't know how many have. And then our last crack at this is the online survey.
That's right. So Kara, our communication person, will do a push out in all the traditional ways to get people linked to the survey. If task force members want to go to, and we've talked about this, right, to comment, you'd mentioned it at the last meeting, I think, Carol, going to the market. Michelle had talked about going to a seniors lodge or a seniors resident to try to get those folks. Nicole has created a QR code so that you can take a phone or a tablet and people can just scan the QR code and really quickly do the survey. So if the task force wants to organize being in busy public spaces and trying to recruit folks to do that, I'm happy to work with you to set that up. We have also asked the Business Improvement Association, which is basically all the businesses in the downtown core. They have ambassadors for the summer and they are going to give their ambassadors the QR code. And so as the ambassadors are talking to folks, they'll also have, that will mostly be visitors, not locals, but they'll have an opportunity to fill out the survey as well. So the BIA is on board with that. But if you want to organize, or if anybody yet wants to organize going somewhere as a task force member, Nicole's created a document that I can share with you that makes it really easy for people to get to the survey.
Can you just share that document with everybody, or?
I'll send it to the whole task force. Yep, absolutely. And if you want something formal, like if you want to go to the market, I can help create a booth or a stand or a space in the market. So anything that's like a town of Canmore venue, if people want to do that or go stand in Elevation Place or whatever, just let me know and I can, help pave the path to make sure people know that you're there on official business.
Thank you.
And the numbers, Nicole, I'm assuming you'll send me your updated PowerPoint as well. I think you added one slide from the version I had from this morning, but we'll send that out also. So you'll have the updated numbers, Carol, in Nicole's slide, which we'll send out to you.
Yes.
And also just a technicality, when I get an invite from Sarah, and there's no way I can respond that I'm attending the meeting or not attending the meeting. It's just me. It must be on my phone. I get a notice. The subject line never says when the date is, just a small technicality, but I'd like to know that.
Sure.
And it just says, here's the Zoom link. And then I don't have an option to reply back. But I noticed today when I logged in, there was that. I have to be on a big screen to be able to tell you.
Yeah, instead of
But
your
I'm
phone.
always I'm on my phone all the time.
Well, I'll let Sarah, I'll give her the suggestion of the subject line. And then what you can always do, we just assume people are coming unless they tell us they're not. So if you can't make it, you can send an email to Sarah or me and let us know. But otherwise we assume you'll be here and so that's all good. Michelle, did you have something?
Well, it's just a comment on that from a former teacher, me. I think it's super important that we're all here as a task force. I think that's why we're here, and we've all put a lot of time and effort, everybody has, and so I think it's important that everybody makes the best effort to get here. And I would say that a reminder email prior to would not be out of the question, saying, we have that, we have a meeting coming up, and if you can't make it, please let me know. Otherwise, we'll be expecting to see you. And I personally myself would find that totally legitimate, because if it slipped my mind or whatever, and I just think it's super important.
Yeah,
people are busy, and I'm sitting in Jasper National Park right now camping, and so I had to really focus to remember. And there just might be a lot of people like that right now, but it is important that our task force is here, and I personally think it's legit to get a reminder.
I'll ask Sarah to do that for the next meeting as well.
Just for all your sakes, because there's so much work everybody is putting into this that it's a shame. It's raining in Jasper.
Enjoy being there, Michelle. I hope you're getting out and having a great time. It's a beautiful place to be. Anybody have anything else? There's still a couple hours of good daylight left. Hope you can all get out there and enjoy it. Yeah. Have a great night, everybody. Okay.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Nice to see you.
Okay.
Bye, everybody.